next session is actually online. Unfortunately, he could not come, but he will talk about red teaming, which is really interesting. He's currently an independent security researcher, and again on the side of red teaming. And after this talk, you will have more understanding of what red teaming actually is and all the life cycle about it. So I present you Arun.
Cool then. Hello everyone, welcome to my talk. I am Arun Nair, joining you virtually today. While I couldn't be there in person, but I'm really excited to share my journey and insights about Red Team Infra Automation with you all. I'll also be talking you through my experiences, including some hard-learned lessons that led me to develop better approaches to infra setup. So let's dive in. I will be quickly sharing my screen. Just a confirmation again if it's visible. I will be turning off my cam as well. Can you all see my screen? Okay, cool. So I will skip my. Yeah. So let me share a story that many of you might relate to. So in my previous role, I was tasked with setting up a red team infra. Like many of us, I also started with the basics, putting the team server directly on the internet, like using SOCAT redirectors for like redirecting everything, and like having SSH accessible on internet. And well, like that didn't go well, and I got a like bomb from a lead that time. So just kidding, like he was a nice guy, so he actually guided me on how it has to be done perfectly and what things to avoid during setting up a red team infra. So the that experience taught me a valuable lessons, and setting up a proper red team infra isn't about just making things work somehow. Yeah. So I chose this So I chose this title because it perfectly captures the a key misconception like many of us face when transitioning from playing CTF to real world red teaming. Like how it works is like a classic CTF scenario works is you do a port scan, you find a vulnerability, you exploit it, you get a shell. That simple and straightforward, right? I remember those days very well. But in reality, things are different. Like yeah, in the real world, like things are very different. Like getting initial access through RC is very rare. You can't risk like disrupting your target, and your payload needs to be delivered by a deliverable method. It means, for example, if you are delivering your payload via exploiting your target, there are some restrictions like size, and you can't fit in your payload or shellcode within that size constraint. And also, when you are targeting a real world engagement or a big organization, many times web proxies and EDRs are subject to like disrupt your payload and shellcode, which you also need to encounter and bypass during a red team engagement. So it is not very straightforward as it used to be like during the CTF games. Now, so now we in the previous slide we talked about like how real world engagements are not like even close to how we used to play in CTF environment. So in real world engagement, like there has been multiple stages which has been developed over time, starting with reconnaissance, also called like gathering information about your target. So where you gather all kinds of information like usernames, they're all subnets, like IP information, like employee information from the LinkedIn and whatnot. Like any information that can aid you to get initial access or achieving your target in red teaming is done during the reconnaissance phase. And based on whatever data you collected during recon phase, you have to get initial access. Let's say you got some exploit or let's say SQL injection vulnerability in one of the web server, or it can be also via phishing where you're directly phishing the user to get their O65 access or phishing the user to deliver your payload. And after you get initial access by phishing or RC, the thing that you do is like it's a cyclic phase, starting from establishing persistence so that you don't lose your access that you have gotten. Otherwise, you would have to repeat all the steps all over again, like doing recon, getting another fish, and getting access again. So you want to make sure that you are getting a perfect persistence, which is calling back to your malware C2 server. And from there on, you have to like collect, like gather information depending on whatever your objective is. For example, if most of the times objective is to get DA or move laterally from on-premise to cloud, in that case, I will start with like gathering who all are the domain admins, where all their current sessions is, what all groups they're part of, what normal user have access, whether normal users have generic right or generic all access to those users and so on. And from there on, you would see vectors for privilege escalation, like escalating your privileges from normal user to a local admin or domain admin. And you would also want to see if you can pivot or laterally move from the machine on which gain foothold to any other machine, because it's obvious that many times you won't achieve your objective on from the same machine that you got foothold on. And from there on, like if you until you don't achieve your objective, you would keep repeating the step, and at some point you will achieve the objective. And that's how the red team phases end. So this talk is specifically about infrastructure, like setting up infrastructure and automating it. So where all we can, in previous slide, we talked about the phases and where all we can fit the infra components to these phases. So starting with the reconnaissance or information gathering phase, you do not want to perform scanning or information gathering from your company laptop or from your personal laptop. You want to make sure that you're routing the traffic via some cloud instances that is not giving your trace back to your personal laptop or company laptop. So for that, you would want to set up an attack box, which is working as a proxy as well as an attack tool, which has all the attack tools installed, like starting from hashcat, nmap, and so on. Whatever tool you would want to use during your red team phase. And then comes multiple components like for getting initial access. So let's say you found some RC, or let's say you want to target a company user, you want to perform phishing. So for that, you need to have a phishing server. Phishing server will have GoPhish or Mailgun or SMTP redirector. And it needs to also have payload server, so that your payload, you're not giving an exe via Teams or email. It needs to be hosted on some cloud provider or on some website. And then all the activities that the malware is doing, the operator is doing, or or the traffic that is being generated needs to be logged as well, for which you need to have a logging server. And then finally the C2 server, which is used to communicate with the malware that is residing on the target. So all the communication will be done by the C2 server, or it's also called the team server. And even after you get initial access on the target, you would want to perform something called post exploitation, where you are used to using various open source tools, let's say Rubius or Watson for privilege escalation, and you don't want to use these tools as it is. You would want to make sure that they don't contain the metadata artifacts, or they are also evading the existing EDR and EVs. So you have to have a CI/CD pipeline defined to make sure that every time you are using these tools during post exploitation, they are free of those artifacts and metadata. So this is how you fit these components in your red team lifecycle. And these are some of the essentials things that you need to have in your red team infrastructure, starting from scalability. So you need to make sure that your infrastructure is scalable. For example, let's say your team server or data is burnt. You need to you need to have the capability to add more team server or redirector or logging server. You need to also have capability to include more operators to your infrastructure. And second comes the security. Since we are dealing with the very sensitive information of our client, we need to make sure that all the data that is in rest as well as in transit is encrypted, obfuscated, and is not hackable. And third, final design sessions is streamlined. Like every time you do a red team, you are using the same infrastructure. Like most of the components are same, like starting from team server, redirector, phishing server, and all. And every time you don't want to like manually set these things up, you want to automate most of the things, like setting up EC2 instance, setting up CDNs, setting up Lambda function for serving your payload, and so on. So that's why the most important part is streamlining your infrastructure, which is what we are going to talk about. So, talking about the traditional and modern difference between traditional and modern infrastructure, these are some of the key points. A traditional infrastructure used to like bastion host, which is what I told you in my story. Like to access each instance like team server, RedDLK, payload server, it doesn't need to be, it should not be exposed to internet directly. The access needs to go via some jump host or the bastion host or the smart redirector. Like whenever your payload on the target is talking to the C2 server, the traffic should not be redirected as it is to your C2 server. There has to be some kind of a smart conditional check to make sure that the traffic is coming from your target and not from anywhere else. And as I mentioned, like all these activities, like the traffic generated from your redirector, the commands run by your payload, all these things generate some kind of a log. And you need to make sure that all these things are logged on a on a specific server for which we are going to use logging server. And we are living in a cloud only world, so we need to make sure that we are also integrating and using cloud services such as in AWS CDN, Azure CDN, and so on. And traditional infrastructure used to lack OPSEC practices. Means, as I mentioned, like team server is exposed on internet, redirector is redirecting all the traffic as it is. Your SSH is public, SSH is missing key-based authentication. So you need to make sure that some of the OPSEC practices are also there, which is there in the modern infrastructure. And the traditional infrastructure also doesn't used to have automated tools and script, which is there in the modern infrastructure to automate all the things. And these are some of the prerequisites before setting up a red team infra. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is the like some of the most important ones. First is you need to have a domains. Like you can substitute domains by using CDNs and all, but obviously you need to have a domain for sending emails and receiving emails from the target. And for domain, you can use Namecheap, GoDaddy, Route 53. This is again not a comprehensive list. And then you need to have some kind of a virtual private server to host your main infra. For that, you can use EC2 instance, Azure VM, or DigitalOcean droplets. And then comes the web services. So it's very tough to set up your own SMTP server, trust me. So for that, you can also use available services like Mailgun, SendGrid, MailChimp. Like the list goes on. It's up to you, like whichever you're comfortable with. And then you need to have extra capabilities like setting up SSL traffic so that all the traffic that is coming from a payload to the team server is encrypted, all the traffic from redirector is encrypted, and also code signing certificate to make sure that the payload that you're using is like having a code signing certificate make sure that it blends in with the target more closely, and it is more likely to evade EDR and AVs as well. It won't guarantee, but most likely. And as I mentioned, like having a domain is the most important thing. And when talking about domain, it needs to have a reputation and category as well, and it needs to have a good age as well. Like I have some experience in my past where I was using a domain less than 6 months year old, and just because of that condition, it was not landing on the target's email at all, even though it had good reputation category. So you need to make sure that your domain is also aged well. And for having all these categories like good reputation, good category, and good age, you can use a framework called expired domains where you can get a already existing categorized domain and it's also well aged. And just in case if you're not able to get a domain from expired domain that matches closely with the target profile, which is used for like which you are planning to use for phishing, you can buy your own domain. You can host some bogus website on it, and you can also send the domain for categorization. So it's also recommended to like collect the domains and like keep farming them and keep having it even before your red team engagement starts. And these are some of the websites which you can use for categorizing your domain, checking the category, and also sending your domain for categorization. And this is a simple image. Like to the left side, you can see when I purchased a domain, it was the category is passed, which means there is no category at all. And then I use Palo Alto framework to send a form saying to categorize my domain. And before doing this, I made sure that I'm hosting a simple website. And for example, if I want to categorize my domain for e-commerce, I'll make sure that I'm hosting some kind of an e-commerce website like similar to Amazon, or the one that is closely matching with the target profile. And then I sent the mail, and after a few days, I got a mail that my domain has been categorized to business and economy. So this is a very basic setup for the phishing setup or phishing infra for credentials, where we are using EvilGenX. First, the step looks like this. We are using GoFish for sending a phishing email. It goes via SMTP redirector to remove all the metadata and artifacts of our GoFish, like GoFish headers, GoFish host name and all. And then it sends the data to Mailgun. Mailgun has an inbuilt SMTP capability where it automatically sends the mail to the target user, and then target user visits our email, visits the website that is mentioned on the email, and goes to the web page, which is using EvilGenix in its backend to capture the credentials as well as cookie. So EvilGenix is the framework used for capturing both credentials as well as cookie, and it acts as a middleman for the website that you want to fish. For example, if this target, we want to fish this target for O65 access, we will create a fishlet in EvilGenix for O65. And as soon as this target visits this website, they will be asked for credential, and that credential will be sent by EvilGenix to Office 365, and then it will receive the cookies, and that cookie will be sent to target user. So at this same time, the EvilGenix server and the target user will have both cookies, and that same cookie we can utilize, we as in the operator can utilize to log in as this user. So that's how this phishing setup works. And just in case you want to have some kind of an interactive session or interactive communication with the target, you can also do it. So that's where the SMTP redirects comes into play. So any email that is replied by the target will automatically be redirected to our IRED mail, which is just like a like GUI of your email. You can read all your emails, you can reply to all your emails, and this is facilitated by the SMTP redirector. And similar setup we have for phishing for malware as well, where we are doing the same thing, but we are not asking the user to visit the OSCP website, but in this case, we are asking the user to download our payload, and this payload will be using will be sending traffic to redirector. Redirector will see whether this traffic is coming by genuine target or not. If yes, then it will send to the C2 server, or else it won't send at all. And we are also using a payload server to make sure that, and the payload server will also have a redirector to make sure that the request is coming by the target user. So you can set, if you already know the domain name or the target username or the host name of the user, you can use that as a conditional check to see who the request is coming from. And as I mentioned, like as I've been talking a lot about redirector. So now let's talk about what are the risks of hosting your red team infra without redirector. Let's say if your phishing infra, your C2 infra or payload server is hosted on public cloud without a redirector, so they are subject to all these actors. One is the bot. Your bots will be continuously scanning the internet, and if they are able to find that some services and ports are open on the server, they will continuously spam those services, leading it to DOS or maybe exploit if there's any vulnerability. There are also malicious hackers that will continuously scan for internet to see what are some exposed C2 server ports. For example, on the right side, if you see, it's a bot which was able to find Cobalt Strike exposed on internet, and it posted on the Twitter. And similarly, you can see there are other posts as well. And then comes the blue teamers. If you are doing a red team engagement, and if you're not using redirector, and if the blue teamers are able to get the domain name or the IP address that you are using for your red team infra, they will directly be able to access and identify that this is some kind of a malicious server. Let's block this. But if you are using a redirector, you can mask the traffic to make it look like that traffic is coming from a website rather than your payload server, phishing server, or C2 server. So this is just a one of how you can yourself hunt malicious infrastructure. So Census is a portal where you can scan internet for open ports and services. So here I'm looking for specific SSL certificates. So this certificate I know is for Cobalt Strike. And if I look for the certificate, you can see I can see certain IP, which I'm sure that it belongs to some publicly hosted Cobalt Stack server. And similarly, you can also scan from the response of the server. You can see if any server on the internet is responding mythic, then it means it's a mythic server. And similarly, you can also look for like open directory to see if any kind of a payload server is being hosted on the internet. And doing this, I was able to find a Cobalt Strike payload server where you can see I was able to get beacon.exe. And you can do the same thing by Shodan as well. You can like look for either open port, which is 50050 for Cobalt Strike, or some other port for some other C2 server, and like product name, HTTP response, and so on. It's a similar thing. So now how can you make sure that the same thing or some actor or bots are not scanning your scanning your C2 server or phishing server? So that's where redirectors come to the rescue. First is redirectors provide obfuscation, means any communication that is happening from C2 server to the target malware is obfuscated. So even if some actor is able to get the traffic, they won't be able to read anything just because it is encrypted and obfuscated. And second thing is like Redirector provides an option for vulnerability. It means just in case if redirector 1 is blocked, the defender or blue teamers are able to identify the redirector and they block that IP, they block that domain. We can quickly set up a second redirector without having to rely on the first redirector at all. And the last thing is like it acts as an intermediate layer. If even if a bot or hacker is scanning an internet, they will never be able to reach our C2 server because C2 server is hosted privately, and on top of it, it also has a condition to check from where the traffic is coming from. So if it sees that if the traffic is coming from not redirector, then it won't accept the traffic at all. It will just simply deny the traffic. And the goal of the redirector is like to design to handle specific protocol. So there are redirectors for HTTP, HTTPS, DNS, SMTP. So a redirector should be able to understand and handle all these protocols. And deception, if you are using a redirector and if a blue teamer or defender is able to identify redirector, they will just see a web server. That's it. They will just see a Apache web server which is hosting a normal website. So they from that they won't be able to identify whether it's a malicious web server or a genuine server. And it should be a cloud based. Like since as I mentioned, like we are living in a cloud era, and cloud is like easily accessible to us. So we have to make sure that the redirector is hosted on cloud so that it is accessible across the world, no matter where our target is. And it should be lightweight and minimalistic. The only thing that you need to set up a redirector is Apache server or Nginx server, and depending on like whichever your favorite is. And last thing is it should be automated. Like we should never, or we should avoid setting up redirectors like manually to avoid some basic error. We should have a script ready to automate the redirect setup so that even if one of the redirector is caught, we should be able to immediately set up another redirector. So speaking about redirector, there are primarily two types of redirector. One is, as you can see, called a dumb redirector, which was the first redirector that I used in my first engagement using SOCAT. So it redirects everything that is coming from everywhere to our C2 server. It won't do any kind of a checks. It won't do any kind of a conditional access checks and so on. It will redirect the traffic as it is to the C2 server. And second redirector is smart redirector, where it is doing multiple checks. First, it is checking URL filtering, whether the URL of the traffic has specific keyword or specific directory or not. The HTTP traffic has specific headers or not, or the IP-based filtering, whether the traffic is coming from specific IP, or the geolocation. Let's say my target that I want to target is based out of India, and the traffic is coming from USA, then that traffic is not genuine. Then I will not accept the traffic. I will deny the traffic and I won't send it to C2 server. So these are some of the checks that the redirector can do before forwarding the traffic to C2 server. And you can also use CDN as a redirector. The main advantages of using CDNs is like it has a global presence. Means if you're using CDN, it can be accessed from anywhere. There's no worriness of isolation or anything networking or anything. Scalability, it like it can handle as much traffic as you want. If let's say if you're sure that traffic is going to be very less, then just a second. Yeah. So if you know that your traffic from the target is going to be very less, then you can, yeah, you can use a less powered or less pricey CDN. And if you know that traffic is going to be more, then it is going to be scaled automatically. You don't have to worry about that. And it also gives custom domain, and that domain also contains the Azure. Let's say if you're using Azure CDN, it will contain Azure websites.net, which has reputation benefits, and most likely in most organization that is also whitelisted. So even if the defender is able to find your malware, they won't be able to blacklist it, because if they do it, many things will break in their environment. Because already many O365 applications like Teams and Outlook rely on Azure CDNs, and also it provides inbuilt SSL and TLS encryption. So you don't have to worry about buying certificate and doing encryption and all. It has inbuilt encryption in place. So these are some of the advantages of using CDNs over your own domain. And now comes the now comes the big picture, which is the foundation of our red team infra, the AWS Virtual Private Cloud or VPC. So this is important for maintaining the security and isolation of our operation. So as you can see in this diagram, a VPC provides us with a secure, isolated, and customizable networking environment. So which is essential for red team operations, where we need to maintain strict control over our infra and prevent any unintended exposure. We don't want to expose any of our components to the internet. And next up is a bastion host, also known as a jump host. So this serves as a controlled entry point into our private network from the outside world. So as you can see in the diagram, bastion host acts as a bridge between our external network and a network. That's as the operator, and our internal or the target, where the sensitive information is there. One second. Yeah. Yeah. So now comes the backbone of our infrastructure. So this is currently how the whole infra is looking like. So this doesn't contain all the components, but I tried to fit as much components as possible I could. So this is us, the operator, and if he wants to use any of the components inside the AWS, it has to go via internet gateway, and all the instances will only be accessed by the bastion host. If somebody or the operator tries to access any of these instances directly, they won't be able to do, because there's an access restrictions to go via only bastion host. And also for the team server C2 server, even if the operator has to use the C2 server, the traffic has to go via the bastion host. And we have two subnets. One is the public subnet, second one is the private subnet. We have hosted our components that is supposed to be on internet, for example, redirector, evasion, and bastion host. And the components that are sensitive in nature, like RedDLK, phishing server, C2 server, they are not supposed to be on internet. So we have kept them in private subnet only. So they can only be accessed by bastion host, and rest of these components are accessible on internet for the specific services. Like redirector, we can access the 443 and 80 port. Same for the evasion, and bastion host only port 22. Rest of the port will be closed. And if these components have to talk to internet or download something, that traffic needs to go via the NAT gateway, and the NAT gateway will route the traffic via internet gateway. So this is how the flow of our framework looks like. And so far I have talked about the infra components and what to do and what not to do. And sorry, hello. Okay, sure. Yeah, so I will try to quickly finish it up. So yeah, so the primary reason of the talk is to automate all these components, where, like, I believe the most powerful tool is Terraform, but you're free to use any framework that you use, like CloudFormation. But for me, Terraform is the most powerful and the easiest one. So how it works is, as you can see in the diagram, we write our own code. Let's say if I want to set up two EC2 instances, one Lambda, one like a CDN, so I can define that in this IAC code, and then I run plan and apply, and then at the backend it will be calling the certain APIs. If I'm using AWS, it will be calling AWS provider API, and then using that API, those instances will be set up for me. So that's how the whole IAC using Terraform looks like. And second comes the Ansible. So Terraform is good for provisioning your infrastructure like EC2 instances, CDN, S3 buckets and all. But actual configuration, let's say I want to set up a web server that readers traffic from specific IP. So Terraform, what it can do is it will only set up a EC2 instance, but the actual configuration management and configuration setup needs to be done by the Ansible. So Ansible comes into play where you want to actually set up RedDLK or web server, team server, phishing server, and all. So those are defined already in the Ansible playbook. And this is how the high-level flow looks like. We define our code in the Ansible playbook, and we have an inventory where we want to mention where all this code will be applied to. And then Ansible in the backend uses SSH to SSH into each host and perform this configuration to make sure that this code is applied to each of them. And how in our infrastructure, how it is working is we are using Terraform for provisioning our infra and using Ansible for actual management. And all this is done by the Bastion host. So our infra will first set up a Bastion host, and then using the Bastion host, it will automatically SSH to each component that was provisioned via Terraform to set up those things. Like for redirector, there's a specific playbook. For C2 server, there's a specific playbook, and for RedDLK, there's a specific playbook. And this is how the whole framework is divided into. First is the clients, where the actual configuration for each client network goes into, and each will have its own SSH, own variables, providers, and all. And second, in the middle, as you can see, is where the actual core Terraform code is written. For example, for Bash nodes, there is a specific module. For VPC, there's a specific module. For DNS reader, there's a specific module. So this is not a complete list, so I try to fit in this PPT. And third is the Ansible playbook. Let's say our component C2 server is pinned up by the Terraform, and then comes the Ansible part where it will go and do the actual installation, like installing Cobalt Strike, installing Havoc, configuring it, making sure it is OPSEC safe, and so on. This is how it works. In the main code, you define what all variables are. For example, if in this I'm specifying the team server needs to be Daisy, Ken, and Hacker. And then this is the main model for the team server, and this is the playbook for the Havoc, where it's going ahead and installing the tools and setting up the Havoc team server. And so far we talked about like red team infra components and also how to automate it using Terraform and Ansible. During the post exploitation stage also there comes a time where you need to use many open source tools like Rubius, Watson, and so on. The list goes on. And those open source tools are like already like they contain a lot of IOC. So if you use as it is in the environment, they're most likely going to get caught. So for that also you can use a GitHub workflow to make sure that whenever you are cloning that tool, it is already removing the known IOCs. So what you can do is you can define a workbook or a GitHub workflow in your own GitHub. And whenever you are defining your infra, red team infra, you can clone from your GitHub instead of the actual GitHub. And whenever it clones, it makes an event is triggered. On that event triggered, it will pull a code from the actual repository. And while it is pulling, it will remove all those IOCs. And then it will serve that code which does not have any IOCs to us. And the same thing can be done for any tool like GoFish. And this is one example where Melvin is doing for the EvilGenX tool, where he's removing all the static IOCs for the EvilGenX tool. So as I mentioned, like what all activities we do has all kinds of logs be generated, be it C2 read server, be it redirector, or be it payload from our target, be it blue teamers accessing our redirector. So all these activities are generating some kind of a log. But the logs that we see everywhere are in this format. They are definitely not readable or in consumable format. So they need to be converted into some consumable format before we make analysis of it. So that's where the ALK stack comes into picture. So ALK stack, I obviously don't need to explain what it is. I'm sure that most of you already know. So it has three components: Logstack, Elasticsearch, and Kibana. Logstack, as it sounds for like collecting and transforming the data into readable format or consumable format. Elasticsearch is a database where we can search and analyze all the data that was stored by Logstack. And then Kibana we can use to visualize our data. For example, if a client asks from which IP address you saw most of the traffic, or from which region, where from which region that most of the traffic was generated from. So you can perform all this analysis and visualization using the Kibana framework. So there's a red team version of the ELK tool available, which has all these capabilities inbuilt in, and it has all the pre-built dashboards as well, where you can see the redirector, C2 server, SMTP redirector dashboards as well. And on the screen, you can see like this is the traffic generated by me. Every time I access a redirector, it is being logged, and it will automatically do the resolution for me, where it will see the GOCT name, country code, source IP, user agent, and all. And so far we talked about how we can set up and automate it, but how we can like create a different templates. Like we are not just doing a red teaming. Red teaming has multiple phases. Like red team has internal PT, APT simulation, like where you want to simulate a specific APT like Cozy Beer, and they are using their own TTPs, their own framework and all. So for that, you can create your own template where you can use the same modules which I saw in in the previous slides. And for example, if Cozy Bear is using DNS redirector, you can use DNS redirector module. And if Cozy Bear is using Cobalt Strike with specific, let's say Amazon profile, so you can copy the Amazon profile and Ansible playbook for Cobalt Strike from the already existing code, and you can create or copy other script and file, and then you just have to do Terraform run. It will automatically set up a infra mimicking the Cozy Bear APT group. So that's how you can create your own template, and that's how we also do it. We have our own templates created for each APT group, each adversary that we want to simulate during, so that you don't have to do your research and set up those components manually yourself. So that's it from my side. So is there any questions or feedback? Please feel free to like provide it in the chat, or you can also reach out to me on Twitter or email. So I would be happy to take any feedback or any questions.
Thank you, Arun, for the presentation. Sadly, we do not have enough time for questions,
Yep.
but thank you. We learned a lot of new things, so that's it.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So then, thanks Eva for having me, and unfortunately I couldn't be there.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So then, have a great event.